panelists, starting with going from the audience's left to right. So first we have Sharon Ricci, who is with Pfizer. She's held various roles in the Pfizer's intellectual property department since 2004, and she is currently Assistant General Counsel and Head of Global IP Policy and Advocacy. Thank you for being here, Sharon. Next, we have Hans Sauer, who is Bio's man on IP. He is the Deputy General Counsel and Vice President for Intellectual Property for the Biotechnology Industry Organization. Hans, thank you for being here. Next, we have the Honorable Paul Michel, who is the retired Chief Judge from the United States Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Thank you, Your Honor, for being here. And last but certainly not least is Brad Watts, and Brad is currently Vice President of Innovation Policy at the United States Chamber of Commerce Global Innovation Policy Center. And he, many of you will remember, he was Senator Tillis's man on intellectual property for quite a number of years when he served in the Senate Judiciary Committee. So thank you all for being here. What I'd like to do is go through one by one. We can go in the order in which I introduced you and get your preliminary thoughts on the idea of bad policy and misconception.
All right,
Sure.
So let me repeat that brilliant quote by Gene Quinn, which is, if you're gonna lie, lie big. And so I wanted to spend a quick minute here in the intro talking about what's called the illusory truth effect. And this is a phenomenon that was first observed in 1977. It was a study out of Villanova and Temple University. And if you're not familiar with this, I want to just quickly explain this study because I think it's really important to what we're going to talk about today. So what the researchers did is, on 3 separate occasions spaced about 2 weeks apart, they had the same group of students review a list of 60 trivia facts. And they asked, and these were a mix of true and false statements, and facts also that the students were pretty unlikely to know whether they were true or false. And they asked the students to rate their confidence in the validity of the statement. And what the researchers did is, over the course of the 3 sessions, there were 20 statements out of the 60 that were repeated every single time over all 3 sessions. And then the other 40 facts that made up the 60, they changed. And what they found is that the students' confidence in the truth of those 20 repeated statements increased from the first session to the second session, and then again from the second session to the third session. And so their conclusion was that repeating a statement makes it more likely to appear factual. And I personally believe that this is a tactic that's being used by several organizations to influence policymakers, right? If you say it enough time, essentially at the end of the day, it's going to start to sound true to you. And when it comes to complex and technical policymaking, we need to make sure that our policymakers have access to reliable and accurate information, because when we get to the point where they can't tell fact from fiction, just as Sherry noted before, we're going to start to see some undesirable outcomes and unintended consequences. And when it comes to the law governing IP, as we all know, that is one area where misinformed policymaking is really going to have a detrimental impact, particularly since the patent system is what drives American innovation. So we need to make sure we're having factual, evidence-based debates, but we do have groups out there that are leading campaigns of misinformation, which I know we're going to get to in more detail in a bit.
Great, thanks a lot, Sharon. Hans, your initial thought here about the topic.
Yeah. So I was ready to take the baton straight from Sharon, but I'd save some of it for later, because Sharon does have a slide up, and you're going to talk more about what's on that slide. So maybe I'll just say a few words about, yes, the narratives that are being repeated and how we see this being operationalized in public discourse. So first, I would start by saying the creation of these narratives and how they're being amplified, first of all, is well-funded, right? So publicity and the establishment of narratives in public discourse doesn't happen by accident. It happens through effort. It happens through strategies. It happens through a plan. Right? Constant repetition is important. constant reinforcement is important, but you also need to have something to feed into the dialogue all the time, something that makes it look like we have more news, and now we get to talk about this subject again. So some of the, I would say, the more academic or the content creating groups on the other side of this, I think are well established, they're well funded. For the most part, we don't have a good view on how much funding actually goes into the creation of anti-pharmaceutical IP narratives, but with some of the funding foundations, we do. So for example, the Arnold Ventures Group is one of the major funders, and not the only ones, right? I'm not talking about groups like Doctors Without Borders or Oxfam with all their money. We don't really know how much is being put on, but for I-MAK, and the Arnold Foundation, we do know how much money goes into this. What I-MAK received, at least $6 to $7 million over the last 4 years to support the kind of work and scholarship they're doing, their reports. The Kesselheim Group at Harvard gets multiple times that in research funding. And the way it works is you have a stable of, if you will, academics and other creators of reports and contents. They're funded, they write reports. I-MAK is on the 4th or 5th iteration of its report. They're all very similar. Same with the Kesselheim Group at Harvard, right? So they might produce a report saying, we studied, let's pick a topic, inhalable drug delivery devices, right? And we studied how these are patented, and we conclude that the practice of patenting inhalers and drug delivery technology delays access to medicines and kills people. Right? This gets published in not legal journals, not economic journals. It gets published in high-impact medical journals where the narrative is addressed deliberately at an audience that doesn't know better. Right? They're talking to doctors. They're not talking to other lawyers. They're publishing in journals where the editors are struggling with curating and peer reviewing this information. Papers by these groups get sent into, let's say, the Lancet, or what have you, a scientific or medical journal, then gets sent out for peer review to allied groups. So they're all peer reviewing each other's papers. They then get published. Then you have a publication. That's not enough. What you then need is a public communications group that turns this new content into news. So not only is a study published, then we see secondary reporting in various journals. Axios is one example of, new study came out, inhalers cause all sorts of problems when they're patented. And then there's a news cycle, and then we're done with that. 3 months later, next study comes out. This time it's about metered dose injectors for diabetes patients. Same story. We studied how these devices get patented. We studied the evils that come from that. Again, it's news. Again, there's another set of publications. And everybody cites everybody in this space. And like you said, eventually it becomes news because it's got to be true. If there's so much reporting about this, if there's so many references that they can cite, all of it on a body of robust funding, and so this doesn't happen by accident. I think it's well planned. It's professionally executed, and the fact that these narratives gain a hold in public discourse is no accident. So one quick word, what is the narrative that we're talking about? It's not just patents are evil in pharmaceuticals, and patents are a cause of how drug pricing. If I had to encapsulate the overall story that's been put together, it would be one of pharmaceutical companies get a lot of patents on their drugs, many of them. Many of these patents are new patents on old drugs. Implicitly, many of the patents that pharma companies get are actually of poor quality. There are a lot of invalid patents in the system. So goes the story. It's all being done with little interest in the welfare of patients. It's being done out of greed and to extend monopolies. And it must be addressed because this practice is getting worse and it's accelerating over time. Policymakers need to do something. And it's not that the creators of these narratives aren't listening to what, say, innovative companies might say, right? So when the reply is, but what about, the investment in innovation that's going to be really necessary to maintain a flow of new innovative medicines, there's an answer for that too from the other side. The answer is, drug companies, they don't even innovate. What? They don't innovate. They patent these meaningless innovations, like little tweaks, changing the color of a pill, or as the case may be. That's all built into the store. The real innovation, you know where it's coming from? It doesn't come from companies. It comes from the government and the NIH. That's where real innovation happens. What companies do is they merely privatize publicly funded research and the results of publicly funded research, and they lock it up in all these patent thickets. Right? That would be, I think, one internally coherent story that we hear about so often that at this point, I think most policymakers probably believe there's some truth to it, and it's probably actionable. So with that, I would turn it over to my friend.
Pass it over to Judge Michelle here in a minute, but I can't let that go by. I mean, this is a topic that's going to come up throughout the rest of this panel and also the next panel, I believe. But for companies that don't innovate, everybody really wants their latest pill, their latest injectable, their latest product on the market, and find the previous products just no longer substitutes. Well, you have to take that pill 3 times a day. I want the one that you only have to take once a day, or that pill you have to refrigerate, and I want the one that you don't have to refrigerate, or I want the one that you don't have to refrigerate and take once a day, or once a week, or whatever the case may be. But those aren't really innovations.
No, until it matters to you and your family, right? If you don't want to leave your diabetic grandmother at home alone with a vial of insulin and a syringe, then maybe a metered dose auto-injector that has safety features built in would be a better choice. Right?
Yeah, but that's not innovative, Hans. I mean, my God. I mean, everybody deserves the latest.
Insulin has been around for over 100 years. Yeah. How come it's still patented? Well, it's not insulin that's patented, right? It's the drug delivery technology that makes it work.
I think what we really need to do, and listening, and I think I pose this to the panel and the next panel as well, is what we really need to do is work on a Monty Python-like skit that just makes fun of all of these stupid, ignorant things that they say. And maybe that is what will break through to the other side, because it boggles the mind. I mean, Judge Michelle, I'll turn to you to get your preliminary thoughts. And if you also have any thoughts, I mean, you've seen these arguments from the court. You saw them when you were a staffer in the Senate, working for Arlen Specter, and you've observed them since you left the court. So maybe you have some great perspective and some wisdom, some words of wisdom to tell us what we ought to be doing, because it seems to me we're just not being very effective, yet the other side makes all kinds of stuff up. How is that possible?
Well, propaganda works when it's repeated endlessly and comes from many different sources and angles. When PR firm employees put out articles and editorials by the hundreds, and when lobbyists swarm Capitol Hill on a daily basis with the false narrative, it totally drowns out the truth. So that's one dynamic we have to deal with. But I want to call attention, too, to the importance that ignorance plays. If you go back to some of the things Sherry Knowles was emphasizing, the courts have failed the country in a fundamental way with bad policy. First problem is it's not their job to make policy. That's the job of the legislature. But the courts fill in vacuums where they exist and get overextended, which is what's happened quite a lot in recent decades, and particularly since the eligibility court set of cases in 2012 to 2014. The other problem is we don't focus on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are that the patent system is a statutory system. It's not a common law system that courts are supposed to make up as they go along based on their best guess of what might be good policy or what might yield beneficial consequences. So it starts with the Supreme Court. It's repeated at the Federal Circuit level and at lower levels. Most adjudicators are woefully unschooled in basic business economics. The reality of how to incentivize adequate investment in important medical innovation is not well understood by the vast majority of judges. You can see that in some of the comments from the case that Sherry was quoting, a myriad, where Justice Thomas just made certain declarations that are not sound. And you can find similar declarations made with all confidence and no factual backup in the other three eligibility cases from the Supreme Court. And then it echoes down the line. So ignorance is a big problem. The drown-out phenomenon is a big problem. Keeping the branches of government in their proper lanes is necessary, and the lack of people staying in their lanes is part of the fundamental cause of all the trouble, even independent of I-MAK's specific distorted or fabricated allegations. So it seems to me that the path to progress is to restrict the courts to do what they can do best, which is to interpret clear statutory mandates and keep them out of policymaking, for which they're ill-equipped by training and experience, and even their process is no good for policymaking. They get 55 amicus briefs from some professors or some other self-appointed people. They have law clerks who know very little about economics, even less about science. The justices themselves also rarely know much about economics or science. So it's a dangerous venture to have them involved in this kind of policy making. And I could say the same in a similar fashion for the lower level courts, the so-called inferior courts. So the answer is for the courts to stay in their lane, and that means Congress has to force them to stay in their lane by overruling them when they've gone out of their lane, which I would say the eligibility decisions clearly did. And at the legislative level, the legislature has to do a better job of sorting information, of evaluating narratives. One of the things that is needed is for staffers to be better informed, a big challenging job, because not all of them are half as smart as Brad Watts was serving for Senator Tillis. It's the rare staffer who is really well informed and highly logical and able to sort fact from fiction, just to put it that way. But beyond that, the process there, like the process in the Supreme Court, is inherently faulty if witnesses can't be effectively cross-examined, because the witnesses are all biased. They're there because some group has put them up to tell a certain narrative, to achieve a certain economic outcome, and that is hard to detect unless there's effective cross-examination. It's the convention of American justice system that cross-examination is probably the single best engine to expose falsehoods and to get the truth out. But if you can't effectively cross-examine witnesses at a congressional hearing, you can't get the right outcome. So we have a lot of work to do to help Congress do its proper job better, and part of that's to keep the courts out of policymaking, and part of it's to clarify and modernize the law where it's become counterproductive. And we have lots of examples. Sherry Knowles gave some. We're talking about others right now. With respect to the I-MAK misinformation, I'll call it, you could also say they're just lies because they make stuff up. And one of the things they do is they use true numbers, but then they change definitions. So for example, they say there's 70 patents on a certain drug. but there aren't 70 patents on that drug. There might be 2 or 3. The other patents are improvements on that drug. If you look at Section 101, it calls out improvement patents as part of the system, as a desirable, proper legal outcome. But I-MAK says only pioneer inventions should get patents, and improvement patents should not be entitled to 20 years of term. Well, they can say that, but it's completely contrary to clear statements in the Patent Act. So basically, they're saying we disagree with what Congress has legislated. Okay, they can disagree if they want, but unless legislation gets changed, it should be followed by everybody in the government and followed in the private sector. I'm actually quite hopeful that we're going to see big progress in all these lines, because we have now some extremely well-informed and very brave legislators, particularly Senator Tillis and Senator Coons. They've worked together in a bipartisan fashion on these 2 big bills pending now, PARA and Prevail. We'll discuss those over the next several days in greater detail. But they've informed themselves. They have qualified staffers. They're respected across the aisle by both their own fellow party members and many in the opposite party. They know what they're doing, and they're well supported. If we can simply support their efforts, I think the prospect of passing Prevail and PARA and maybe some other legislation that's needed over the next several years is actually pretty good. We're at a sea change. We finally have Senate champions. We didn't have them before. We had Senate destroyers before, including my former friend, Senator Leahy, who just made everything worse in his last term in the Senate. But now we have informed champions who are determined to make everything better. They deserve our support, and we can give them a lot of help that will make a big difference.
Great, thank you very much, Judge. And Brad, your initial thoughts. I mean, whatever you want to say, but the thoughts that come to mind that are on the table that like straightaway in your wheelhouse is I'd love for you to maybe peel back the curtain a little bit on how does one actually get to be a witness during a hearing. I think that would probably shock people to learn. And then 2, does speaking of Senator Tillis, since you worked in his office, do you think that he understands, and maybe not him, since you have a relationship with him or had one, is the rest of the Senate have an understanding that the courts have really ignored at least certain words in key statutes that they put there?
Yeah, so a couple of things before I get to that. First, thank you for having me here today.
Oh,
I
sure.
really appreciate it, and especially thanks to Renee for doing all the logistics and organizing. She is probably one of the big unsung heroes of every event you put on. Also very glad to be on a panel with such wonderful folks, especially Judge Michelle. It was very kind of you to say nice words, but part of, I think, what made me a good staffer was that I had good mentors and people I could turn to like you for honest, objective advice. And fun fact, one that the judge probably doesn't know, his respect on the Hill is unparalleled. Thom Tillis used to always jokingly call you the godfather of the IP system. So, part of why so many good staffers do good work is because of people like all of you. So a couple of things, I guess, at the start before getting to your specific questions, Gene. And Judge Michelle already said it, but I'll reiterate it. The elephant in the room, as the slide suggests, is, I-MAK's data is just not accurate. It's not trustworthy. It's not verifiable. When I worked for the senator, he sent a letter to I-MAK asking them to disclose their data, to reveal their methodology, and they basically sent a reply back that said pound sand. Our data is accurate because it's been quoted in a House Oversight Committee report. And the House Oversight Committee report that quoted their data was literally just a couple of footnotes to their report. I mean, it's kind of circular logic. So his kind of view, Senator Tillis's, was if an organization isn't willing to verify their data objectively, why would you trust that data? And so I do think, it's important to call out not just their misinformation, I don't even think that's strong enough of a term, but active disinformation. building on that point, as Hans noted, part of how some of these narratives take hold is because it's part of a concerted, collective effort by people who have a certain viewpoint, a certain goal, a certain objective to promote and to achieve. I like to think a lot of it is kind of like dating and mission creep. All of a sudden someone leaves a toothbrush over, and then it's a change of clothes, and then it's a couple of toiletries, and then bippity boppity boop, you're in love and you're living together, right? It's kind of the same process, right? Of over time, they build, folks who are pushing these narratives, a network of individuals that echo, that amplify, and that continue to build so that it gets to a point where you can't even question it. Because if you're questioning their data, well, you're not questioning them, you're questioning 30 experts who've all said the same thing. And if you're questioning the findings from this institute, what you're really doing is questioning objective academics, and you're demonstrating that you have no respect for the academic process. That is the tactic, though, and these tactics are well-funded. When I was on the Hill and I was bored one day, which is anyone who worked with me when I was on the Hill knew when I was bored, that was the worst time to deal with me because I came up with all sorts of crazy ideas. But I had one of my law clerks, I told him, I said, I want to get a sense of how much money people have put into, building these anti-pharmaceutical narratives. Start at 2010 and go to present, and this was probably 2021. And I said, look at everything: lobbying disclosures, trade associations, think tanks, advertising campaigns. And the number I'm about to give you is not scientific. Please don't quote it. It's not 100% verifiable. This is back of the hand napkin math, right, based on what we could find. But we were looking at like $300 million, right, over a decade. That is a pretty concerted effort, and that is just based on what we could find publicly, right? Again, lobbying disclosures, paid media, think tank funding. So it's probably significantly higher. These narratives don't just happen organically. They are part of a concerted, targeted effort aimed at achieving an outcome. And again, they get to a point where if you have 30, 40, 50 academics all saying the same thing, it's kind of hard for one lowly staffer or one member of Congress to dispute that, because the instantaneous reaction is, well, you don't know what you're talking about. You're not an expert. These people do this for a living. They're academics. They're objective. They're doing this because it's the right thing.
That's the biggest lie, that academics are objective, because they're funded.
Look, I have great respects for academics as someone who teaches, but you're correct, Gene, it's a misunderstanding that many of these think tanks, not all, many think tanks at universities are funded, right? They are funded by corporate entities, nonprofits, and there's nothing wrong with that, except for the fact that so many people are willing to accept a veneer that anything that comes out of an academic institution is 100% objective. It doesn't mean what's coming out may not be well researched, well thought out, even if you disagree with it, but you can't ignore funding sources, just like no one would ignore funding sources for any other form of research. Right. And I do think, though, that is, for those pushing these narratives, that is the biggest strength they have, is that they have built a network of amplification machines that have the veneer of legitimacy and objectivity, and it is very hard to negate that without significant resources. To your specific questions, when I worked for Senator Tillis and he was the chairman, he tried very hard to pick a balance of witnesses. And sometimes that meant picking people who didn't agree with his worldview and his viewpoint. How I went about it, because I was usually tasked with doing that, is I would think about what is our subject matter we're trying to cover today, who are experts, who's well known in the field. Sherry's been a witness for me. I think a good chunk of the people in this room have testified at one of my hearings before. But you try to look for people who are known experts, who have at least a veneer of credibility, right, who represent viewpoints that need to be heard. But that's how Senator Tillis goes about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's how they all do it, right?
Well, different offices.
I see Judge Michelle laughing.
They approach the process differently. Part of the prerogative of being a chairman of a committee is you can kind of run the committee however you want.
You get to call the witnesses.
I think, though, most staffers try to be objective and to pick people who are going to make sure that a plethora of viewpoints are represented. And oftentimes that means picking and inviting people as witnesses you may not agree with and who are going to candidly throw sand all over your viewpoint. But because if you don't, and I remember this during our 101 hearings, if you don't try to represent all viewpoints, you undermine the legitimacy of your own activity, because people can then instantaneously say, well, you haven't heard from, pick a person.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I think you're being too generous. I know Senator Tillis did go out of his way. I mean, it's obvious. You just look at the witness list, and it was not everybody reading from the same sheet of music.
Well, to build on that,
Often though it is.
I'll just say real quick, 30 seconds to build on that. I mean, I do remember one of the closest times I ever came to just totally losing my temper, which is probably funny for some of you who thought you've seen me lose my temper. But was when it was shortly after our 101 hearings, and someone from one of these organizations that's part of this network of folks pushing anti-pharma narratives had the audacity, when I was on a panel with him, just like this, sitting 3 seats down from him, we were talking about legislative process and the 101 process, had the audacity to say, well, it wasn't a fair process because Senator Tillis didn't hear from enough people. And this is after we had called 45 witnesses, about 18 of whom were not in favor of what we were doing. So the point being, folks who are pushing these narratives are going to try to seize on anything they can to delegitimize whatever you're putting forward, no matter how objective or fair it may be.
So let's dive into that. Sharon, I know we've had this one part of one slide up there while you guys were talking. Maybe what we should do is dive into some of the things that are being said and focusing primarily on I-MAK, because they are the ones in this space, at least, that seem to be the most active teller of tales, is the most polite way to say it. But I mean, number one there. Did I go past number one? Lyrica. They say that there's no generic for Lyrica on the market. And that's just a lie. I mean, it's either a bold-faced lie or it's completely misinformed. Either way, it's being used all the time.
Yeah. And so maybe if I can just take a quick step back
Sure,
on Lyrica.
go ahead.
So as you heard, I-MAK has started this campaign, I guess, targeting very specific products, and Lyrica is part of their campaign. And it first popped up in one of their earlier reports. And since then, we've seen Lyrica. They have a devoted web page on their website on Lyrica. They have a Lyrica fact sheet. So Lyrica is a medicine that was developed by Pfizer, and it was approved for several indications, including fibromyalgia and neuropathic pain related to, make sure I get the name right, diabetic peripheral neuropathy. So I'm going to call that DPN. So the patent that covers the active ingredient pregabalin was filed in 1995. And then following about 9 more years of development, testing, FDA review, Lyrica received approval on December 30th, 2004. And then it was sold exclusively by Pfizer until mid-2019, which is when the compound patent expired. And then less than a month later, generic versions were approved and launched on the market. And I think this actually is a really good example of how the biopharmaceutical ecosystem is intended to work, right? You have an IP system that incentivizes the discovery and the development of a medicine. There's a limited period of exclusivity. In the case of Lyrica, it was about 14 and a half years. And then that invention gets dedicated to the public, and generic alternatives can come on the market. And despite all this, as I said, I-MAK has targeted Lyrica. And so to the very first fact, and so let me say, we didn't see any of their data published until I think earlier this year, when they did release some of their data during the USPTO FDA collaboration session. So we went through their data set, and what we found was a lot of inaccuracies, inconsistencies, misinformation. And we tried to pull out the 4 that were the most easily digestible, right? Because patent law, patents, it can become a bit technical, and then you kind of lose the policymakers. So we tried to pull out the 4 that were the most compelling, I would say, and easily to understand. So the first one that you see up here, as Jean just said, and this comes from their Lyrica webpage, which I just checked it right before I came here. It's still live. This is still exactly what it says, which is that there's no generic Lyrica on the market. Again, this is very easily disproved. there's an FDA news release. I think many people here probably know somebody that takes generic Lyrica. Generic Lyrica is available on the market since mid-2019, but yet today in 2023, they still have this up saying that there's no generic Lyrica approved or on the market. And then, I don't, do you want me just to go through the facts maybe, Jean, or?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so if we go to the next one, here they have the main compound patent, and this is from their fact sheet. So again, there's also a
And what I
fact
should
sheet.
tell everybody is this infographic is linked on the panel URL if you go to IPWatchdog in the Life Sciences 2023, along with the other materials that relate to this topic that will be making up a part of the CLE materials.
Yep, thank you. So the next one we pulled out was they have, again, in their infographic fact sheet, the main compound patent of Lyrica expired in 2013, but secondary patents gave Pfizer 6 additional years of patent protection. Again, very easily disproved. The main compound patent of Lyrica expired June 30th, 2019. It was not extended by 6 years. That's when it expired, and that's when generic versions came onto the market less than a month later. Then we have the third one. Lyrica was set to go off patent at the end of 2018, but Pfizer had filed and was issued patents for an additional 20 years on a controlled release formulation of the product, which is Lyrica CR. And then they conclude with these patents, Pfizer's hold on the market will remain. So Lyrica and Lyrica CR are 2 separate products. The fact that Lyrica CR came onto the market in no way impacted the fact that generic versions of Lyrica were available when the compound patent expired in mid of 2019.
So I just want to jump in here. Their first 3 facts, even if they're not objectively lies, okay, they're internally inconsistent themselves.
Yes,
they say
there
there's
are
no
many
generic,
inconsistencies.
no generic for Lyrica. Then they say Lyrica didn't go into the public domain or until 2019, and then in this third one they say, oh well, it went into 2018. It's like pleading in the alternative. It's like I didn't kill you. I wasn't even there. Well, if I was there, I didn't kill you. And if I was there and I killed you, that I was drunk. Or well, if I wasn't drunk, maybe I had dementia. Or it's like pleading in the alternative. It's like they're looking for a lie that somebody will believe.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
whichever one you want to believe is the one that people grab onto. That's the scary thing, is you hear with I-MAK constantly. It's like, well, they said that, yeah, okay, well maybe that's wrong, but this is surely right. No, they're all wrong.
Yeah, and this is what we found when we started going through all their data and websites and infographics and fact sheets, is that there are so many inconsistencies just among what they're saying. In addition to all of the false information.
And if you could have figured out how to get 42 years of monopoly, right? I mean, you would be like the highest paid consultant in the world. I mean,
Yes.
Pharmaceutical companies would pay you whatever you wanted. I mean, you're struggling to get 14 years.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I don't know how they're defining monopoly, and if that means the only version of your product, again, that's blatantly false, right? Lyrica was exclusively sold by Pfizer for 14 and a half years, not 42 years. And if they're defining that as the only medicine on a market to treat a certain indication, that's also false. When Lyrica was on the market, it faced competition from other products for the same indication. Cymbalta is an example, which also received approval in 2004, was also approved for several indications, including fibromyalgia and DPN. So DPN pain. So again, just blatantly false. I don't know how they come up with these 42 numbers, but if you look on their fact sheet where they have that, it's in big, bold numbers, right? A big red 42. And underneath, it has patent monopoly, right? And so I think for the average layperson or a policymaker who maybe is not very informed, they see that and they grab onto it, and they immediately get this perception in their head that pharmaceutical companies are trying to game the patent system, right? So what we're trying to do is to get the facts out there, and I think that's why we're all up here today, is to encourage everybody here to do more to try to get the facts, to try to have evidence-based conversations. Because again, as just to keep going back to what Sherry said, we're going to have some really undesirable outcomes if we don't start pushing back more on this narrative.
Yeah. Hans, you're sitting there like the with the Cheshire Cat grin on your face. What do you want to say?
Maybe a few words, right? Because it's not, I think, that there's no thinking that goes into creating this, right? Because we've wondered, how do you come up with like a 42-year monopoly? How do you get there? Like in your own mind, how is it done? Right? And this I actually really think is interesting for a drug like, let's take Lyrica. Right? The way it's done is you look at the first patent you can find on the drug. Right? You go and look back in time, and you look when that application was filed. Right? That's your earliest date that you can somehow rely on. So you start with the effective filing date of the very first patent you can find that claims the drug. Right? And then you go all the way to the end and you find the most recent patent application that somehow has something to do with this drug. Right? And you assume that, well, maybe if that patent application, which I found is currently pending, if that application were to be granted as a patent, it would probably expire, and then you can give like a ballpark number. So you start from what earliest filing date to hypothetical latest expiration date of the the earliest and last patent application you can find. And if that interval is 42 years, then it's 42 years, and it allows you to say, well, this is a basis for a monopoly. Elsewhere, in their publications, they talk about attempted monopolies. Right? So sometimes there is a little bit of qualifier in the small print. But basically, that's how you get to 42 years. But in between, they find another 200 patents, but all of them are not relevant. Right? That's just gravy. These other 200 applications that they identified, many of which weren't granted or have become abandoned over time, those don't matter. They're just an additional great number to put on. Here's not just hundreds of patents. There's also endless monopolies. But what they rarely do, in fact, never, right? This is not just I-MAK. It's everybody who's working on that side of the ledger, is people engage in these patent counting exercises. What, and they engage in these like patent term, adding up exercises, and they say that's monopoly. Right? When in reality, the better measure would be just go look and see when generics entered the market, relative to when the originator drug was first approved. That seems to be a pretty good measure of effective market life and effective market exclusivity of what happened in the real world, but it's not done. Right? They rely on nominal patent term. They find some patent that expires really late, and they say that is the monopoly duration. But final word on what do these patents actually claim? I think typically, that very first patent application that's identified, I think that will often claim the drug substance. And that patent will be issued years before the drug even goes to market and is approved by the FDA. That latest to expire patent, I think, will often claim, a third, fourth, or fifth indication that is routinely taken out of the generic label or the biosimilar label. We know that 40% of generics launch with labels that have indications removed from them. It's not very hard to avoid many of these patents and go to market with a nominally non-infringing product. For biosimilars, it's even more. For biosimilars, anybody here is working in the biomedical space? Show of hands real quick. Who's in the biomedical space? Okay. Have you heard of skinny labels? Like a nod, right? Does anybody know how many biosimilars that are in the market today launched with skinny labels? You want to make a guess? 20%? 30%? 50%? 66%, 2 out of 3. Which do you think is the most correct? Anyway, I see a hand go up. Maybe you're right. You saw it. It's 2 out of 3 biosimilars that are in the market today launched with skinny labels. And the main reason for doing that is to avoid patents, right? It's patent circumvention and going to market anyway. So I think this is often overlooked in this debate, right? But again, I will stop by saying, you get to 42 years by looking for that earliest effective filing date, right? And then you find a patent that expires really late, that's not even granted yet. And you count up everything in between, and you call that a monopoly, or at the very least, an attempted monopoly.
Attempted monopoly.
Attempted monopoly.
That's a new one. I mean, none of these are monopolies anyway. I mean, they don't seem to care too awful much about the 90% of drugs that never make it to market. Well, if a patent creates a monopoly, it created a monopoly in those areas too. Oh, wait, it can't because there was no market for that. I mean, the idea that patents create a monopoly is, again, one of the biggest fictions. One of Judge Markey's earliest decisions on the Federal Circuit beat that, explained why it was not true, and yet people continue to use the term. The Supreme Court continues to misuse the term, and that's just another mountain that we need to climb. We got about 10 minutes remaining. I just want to let folks in the audience know, if you do have a comment or question, I can see that microphone out of my peripheral vision. I may not be able to read very close up without glasses, but I can see that right there. So if you do come up to the microphone, I will see you, and we will get your comment to the panel. Judge Michelle, you look like you want to say something.
Just one other thing, like the word monopoly being grotesquely misused by the anti-patent crowd. The other word that gets misused is covered. They say all these follow-on patents cover the drug. Wrong. They don't cover the drug. No. They cover the new indication, the new administration means, etc. They're different, separate inventions. But they never get challenged when they misuse the word monopoly or misuse the word covered. And we have to attack them at that fundamental level. Because if you get down into the weedy details of the science, you're going to lose most of the people in the public square debate. And they're the people, for better or worse, that we have to win over, or we're going to continue to lose ground.
Yeah, Brad, I want to go ahead, and I'll follow up.
Oh, I was just going to say one thing too, and I know we've all discussed this, but I think that's important to draw a distinction about. For folks who are advocating for less patent protection, right, or making claims like, oh, there's no competition on the market. I think for many of them, what they're confusing is there may be competition on the market. That does not mean the market wants the competition. Meaning, how many patients do we know of when that new indication, that controlled release comes out, that's the product they want. Why? Because it's better dosage, it's better peace of mind if they're caring for a family member, or if they don't want to remember to take something 3 or 4 times a day. Naturally, people are probably going to want that better, that newer, that more exciting product. That's why generics don't have a ton of profitability. That's why there are a ton of generic companies that have gone out of business or that are struggling. And so I do think one of the things in this debate that doesn't get talked about enough by policymakers, by advocates, is the fact that many times when a product does go generic, there may not necessarily be as fulsome of a market there because patients want the newest product. And what we have to make people understand is that new product, much like a new car with all the bells and whistles, is expensive. It has a cost. The example I used to always give some of my young staff is it's the difference between a 1985 Honda and a 2019 Lexus. Anyone could, for the most part, make a 1985 Honda without the name. There'd be a trademark issue because all the parts are probably off patent and everything else. There's probably not a huge market for it, right? And it's a very similar concept. And so I do think one of the things we don't talk about enough is the fact that patients want these new innovations. They want these new dosages. They want these new delivery mechanisms. But that does come at a significant cost for all the reasons Gene talked about, because of the failures, the risk, and everything else.
Yeah, and all true. The one thing that I wanted to kind of pick up on, Judge Michelle mentioned this somewhat indirectly, I think, and all of you maybe have talked about, the information that's out there and combating it and getting better information that's out there. Can you speak to that? I mean, one of the things that we always try and do on IP Watchdog is fight these battles. You know, when somebody comes out with something that's just not true like this, I, to the extent that I can, write something. I've written, I don't think even Eileen, this is being streamed to one person, Eileen, our editor-in-chief, who couldn't be here today. I don't think Eileen would let me write another article that says that patents are not a monopoly, you know. But she'll let you guys, if any of you are interested in the audience, and write that kind of perspective. But I hear repeatedly that people in Congress who are looking at this critically would benefit and do benefit greatly from those types of articles, from people writing about taking on the I-MAKs and so forth, because if they're not being taken on, it becomes this vacuum, really, right? There's this perception by maybe not Senator Coons and Senator Tillis and their staffs, and Senator Hirono and others who are, Senator Durbin is another who's big on patent issues and understands these, but to folks who are not on the relevant committees, who are maybe dealing with space issues or agricultural issues or Department of Defense issues or international issues, they don't see any disagreement, then why are you spending time on this? It seems like everybody's got the same story. So if we have a different story, we need to put it out there. And I'm happy to continue to do it, and I will. But I do think it's much more beneficial when there is a broader voice, when more people are involved saying the same or similar things from their own perspective. Am I correct on that?
Yes, and I would add there's a few things there to keep in mind. I mean, first, and most importantly, remembering that members of Congress, their staff, handle so many issues. I mean, my good friend Corey and I were actually talking about this at lunch the other day. A lot of folks didn't realize that probably only about 15% of what I did for Senator Tillis was IP. I handled Supreme Court nominations, abortion, immigration, homeland security, intel, data privacy, right? So staffers are very stretched thin, so that's why it's important to get in there early and educate them, because the folks who are pushing these narratives, they do that. They'll go in and meet with the most junior staffer, who at the time is probably just answering constituent mail, and start, quote unquote, educating them about the patent system. Well, as Judge Michelle knows, being a former chief of staff on the Hill, that junior staffer may be the legislative director for a member of Congress in 3 or 4 years. And then there's now a senior staffer who has been educated about the IP system and is educating their member about the IP system. And so, to your point, publishing, getting things out there, absolutely, but that has to be followed up with an active campaign to educate staff and educate them when they're very junior in their career, so that by the time they are the decision makers for a member or they're advising a member on how to vote, we're not coming in trying to undo 5 years candidly worth of counter programming.
Right.
Yeah, and even though articles by people in the industry are very beneficial, particularly where they pointedly call out lies like I-MAK keeps telling, you cannot beat a phone call to a member. You cannot beat a face-to-face visit with the senior staffers. That means everybody in the industry has to get in the sack. For better or worse, all these issues are now centered in the Congress. That's where they all are, and that's where they're all going to get resolved, for better or for worse. And if we want to have them resolved in a constructive way for the benefit of human health in the short term and the long term, we have to get busy and get active and get visible and get hearable on Capitol Hill with members and staff on a relentless basis. There's no way around it. There's no substitute for that.
And even if you, go ahead.
Just 10 seconds, I'll build on that and say, if you're writing an article, think about who you want your audience to be. If we're writing for practitioners or people in this world, there's a style you can write in. But if you want your article to be read by a member of Congress, realize that other than, I think, Rep. Massey, Rep. Issa, maybe one or two others, there aren't many people who know the legalities of the IP system, right? So if you're writing a very technical response to something like I-MAK, they're probably not going to understand, not because they're not intelligent, not because they don't care, but they don't have the familiarity, and neither do their staff. So keep that audience in mind.
And the other thing, too, is sending an email is quick, easy, and now with AI comments, I mean, the Patent Office just in the comment area, they had to have these AI comments coming in. They got like 19, 20,000 comments. I mean, I don't think that that's particularly useful, but what I am told, and maybe if you could just quickly comment on this, Brad, is very few people actually pick up the phone and call a member's office like they used to do. And what I've been told is that on important issues, if they get a lot of phone calls, they notice because so few people actually use the phone anymore.
They keep account. There's a staffer who keeps a running tally minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day. Who called and is upset about the so-and-so bill that's going to wreck the patent system even further? So people can register effectively what their views are with phone calls, and personal visits are even better. The other thing is people think it all has to be done in Washington. No, it's even better to do back in the home district.
Yeah.
Go see the congressman, have him come tour your lab, have him meet with your people, legal people, and even better, inventive people. That's where the center of gravity is, because all politics in America really end up, as the cliche puts it, being local.
I would agree with all that, and then I would just add to remember all politics are personal. And what I mean by that is if you do go in to advocate and you get a meeting on a patent bill with that lowest level staff member, don't condescend them and think that, just because you may be an experienced litigator or important in the field, that you're going to go in and somehow school them. Because number one, what you're probably going to do is talk to them in a way they don't understand, so they're going to write it off anyway. They're going to be like, okay, whatever. And number two, you're really going to piss them off, and they're going to hold a grudge till the day they leave the Hill. And I know plenty of people who have sat on things for years, because I used to do this, and waited for that right moment to settle a score. So, just keep in mind, part of being a good advocate is realizing we should view this as an opportunity to teach, to engage, to have thoughtful dialogue, because I've found when that happens with staff, you then end up, even if they don't agree with you 100% of the time, developing people with good core knowledge who, even if they make a decision you don't like, or at least making it from an informed place and responding and modifying their arguments and positions based on actual objective facts and not personal passion and prejudices.
Okay, great. So we're just about out of time. We started this panel a couple minutes late, and since it's a CLE panel, we'll just go a couple minutes longer. But we have enough time for our rapid fire elevator speech. What is it that you want people to leave today remembering? So if there's one thing that people remember from today, what do you hope that one thing is? That's the question. And Sharon, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think it was kind of a theme touched on here, but keep it simple. As I think Brad said very well, these people, IP is a very small portion of their portfolio, and that's what we tried to do with this infographic, was just keep it simple so that they can understand what is actually being told to them, what are the facts, black and white.
Great, thanks a lot, Sharon. Hans, you're one thing. When people leave and we go into the break that follows this panel, what do you hope they're talking about?
Well, facts are important. I have a theory about this. So I work for a trade association that has mainly like life sciences companies. All these companies are run by scientists. And when they look at this debate, they all go like, I don't understand. So people could become so misled and so on. What a scientist's belief is that if you give people the correct information, then they're going to make wise decisions, right? So if you educate Congress on the correct facts, like the real facts, then they will make wise policy. I'm a little more of a cynic because I've actually been in meetings, like in Hill offices, where a member of Congress would say, okay, I see your point. I see the problems with this bill. I get it. Thank you for this information. It was very helpful. So we're like, so you're going to vote against this bill, right? And he was like, no, I'm not going to vote against this bill. Right? So we're walking out going like, how does this work? Right? There must be something else at play. Facts, however, matter. If you try with members of Congress and it doesn't work, I know another good place to try, and that's agencies. At the very least, members of Congress are always free to disregard what they hear, right? And they have other deals. But when an agency opens a docket, right, and they take information, that's another good place for you to come in and say, here, I have some data that I want you to consider. And if the agency doesn't consider the data and the information it got and comes out with a terrible rule, at least you can hold the agency because they're required to consider the information that they receive in their docket. So I'm a great fan of data. I don't think they always work, but they're the best we've got. So.
Great, thanks
for
a
that.
lot,
Yeah.
Hans. I really appreciate that. And Judge Michelle, your final thought.
Well, beyond the discrete falsehoods by I-MAK and like groups, there's a tremendous misunderstanding about the economics. I read everywhere that the taxpayers have already paid for the new drug that just came out. That's a complete lie. The taxpayers paid a small portion of upstream research in our great research universities. The vast majority of the money to actually develop a product and go through the regulatory process has to come from private sources. It's not already paid for. And so if we don't incentivize the private investment, we won't get any new drugs, period.
Great, thanks a lot, Judge. And Brad, your final thoughts here.
This is me putting on my advocacy hat, but the reality is we talk about wanting to change the narrative, the broader narrative around the innovation ecosystem, biopharma, life sciences. Facts do matter. Writing, publishing matters. Advocacy matters. But candidly, for better or worse, the thing that matters most is how much money we're willing to put behind those things to make them heard. Money talks, and I don't mean money talks in the sense that, donate $50 to someone and they're going to listen to you. No. What I'm saying is the folks who are pushing these narratives have spent hundreds of millions of dollars educating the public to believe certain things are true. All the things we've talked about doing, we should do, but then we have to put money behind that so that the public hears it, they understand it, and they're calling their member of Congress and saying, why are you advocating for policies that are going to prevent me from getting that newest, latest, greatest product? And that costs a lot of money, and we as the pro-IP community have to be willing to spend that amount of money and time educating the public. Because if we don't, the other side is going to, just like they have for the last 10, 15 years.
And it takes PR firms. I've written about a dozen articles in the last year that were rewritten by some brilliant young people who are not patent lawyers, who are not scientists, who are not economists, but they know how to communicate in 800 words to a mass audience in publications of general interest, like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times or many other papers, or some business papers like Bloomberg. So that's another part of, that's what the money has to go toward, is converting the technical, legal, economic, patent lawyer message, scientific message into simple terms that can be easily grasped and found convincing by the public, and even more important, by people on Capitol Hill. That's where the money needs to be spent.
Yeah, I agree. I was going to say, and I guess I still will, to follow up on what Brad said, and then I'll follow up on what Judge Michelle said. It's great to do these things for free. To go to sit in on lunch and learn at a think tank, or to go at an event that's being held at the Capitol and that sort of stuff. But free only gets you so far. And one of the thoughts that always comes into my mind is it free as in like free beer, or is it free as in free puppies? And because free beer, nobody gives away free beer because that's actually really free when they give it to you, right? They more or less give you like free puppies. This was free, but it comes with a lot of work, right? Now there's a lot of rewards for that work, but it does come with a lot of work. And I think in our space, we ought to be thinking about that sort of stuff, right? Free only gets you so far. And you need to, our good friend, Judge, or actually all of you knew Todd Dickinson, right? You're a very good friend. He used to say, you have to have your butt in the seat. And sometimes that requires money. Sometimes that requires $250 for a plate, $500 for a plate to get your butt in the seat, or it requires an admission price to a conference or this sort of thing. But you see the people on Capitol Hill who do this for a living, they're omnipresent. And they will catch a member who's given a speech, and they'll have 30 seconds, and that 30 seconds is very powerful and useful. And then tomorrow they're going to be at, Senator, what a surprise to see you again today, for another 30 seconds, and so on and so forth. And until our side starts doing that sort of thing, we're gonna lose, because we can look at the infographic, I-MAK lies. I mean, it's just pure and simple. They know it's a lie. They've been told it's a lie. We write about it all the time. We're not the only ones that write about it all the time. And that only gets you so far. So thank you for a wonderful conversation. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jim.